Right. So are you ready to like really dig into the whole Trump trade wars thing,
Yeah,
especially like how it all played out with China?
definitely. It's been a few years now, so it's a good time to look back and see, what the long-term impacts might be.
Yeah, and we've got this really interesting analysis called Trump's Trade War, how China is winning. And honestly, some of the stuff in here is pretty wild. Like, it makes you wonder if those policies actually did what they were supposed to.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Did Trump's approach actually benefit America, or did it kind of backfire and maybe even help China become more powerful?
That's what we're going to try to figure out today. So let's start with those tariffs Trump put on all those countries. Remember
Yeah.
that? It was like Canada, Mexico, the EU. It felt like a tariff tornado. What were those tariffs all about again? And like, how are they supposed to work?
Well, basically, a tariff is like a tax on stuff that's imported from other countries.
Oh,
The idea is that if you make those foreign products more expensive, people will be more likely to buy American-made stuff instead.
right, by America.
Exactly. So the hope is that it'll protect American businesses and create jobs here in the U.S.
Makes sense in theory, but this analysis is saying that it didn't really work out that way in practice.
Yeah, that's the thing about economics. It's all connected, you know?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So, like, when you mess with one part of the system, it can have all these unintended consequences.
So what actually happened when those tariffs went into effect?
Well, one of the big problems is that tariffs don't exist in like a vacuum.
Okay,
When you raise the price of imported goods, it creates this ripple effect.
makes sense.
Like businesses that rely on those imports suddenly have to pay more for their supplies. And then a lot of times those costs end up getting passed down to us, the consumers.
So basically, instead of like saving American jobs, those tariffs actually ended up making things more expensive for Americans. And that doesn't sound like winning a trade war.
Right. It's kind of the opposite of what was supposed to happen. And it wasn't just like a few things here and there. We're talking about prices going up across the board, from groceries to cars to electronics. It really hit people's wallets.
I remember that. My grocery bill definitely got more expensive back then. But this analysis also points to something else that's kind of scary. China's control of this metal called tungsten.
Oh, yeah, tungsten.
That's a big one.
I have to admit, I didn't even know what tungsten was before I read this. Why is it such a big deal?
Well, tungsten is super important for manufacturing a lot of stuff,
Oh,
especially when it comes to like weapons and other essential products.
okay.
It's used in everything, from
Hmm.
smartphones to fighter jets. It's kind of crazy how many things rely on tungsten.
And the problem is that China basically has a monopoly on this stuff, right?
Pretty much, they control like 80% of the world's supply.
80%.
Wow. And get this, the U.S. hasn't mined tungsten commercially since 2015.
So we're basically completely dependent on China for this crucial metal. That seems like a really risky situation to be in, especially considering, all the tension between the US and China these days.
You're telling me it gives China a ton of leverage over us,
Mm.
and they've actually already used that leverage to their advantage.
Wait, really? Yeah. So remember when Trump first put those tariffs on China? Well, China retaliated by restricting their exports of tungsten to the US.
Whoa. So they were basically like, oh, you want to play hardball? Fine, we'll show you hardball.
Exactly. They basically shut off the supply to show us how much we need them. It was a pretty bold move.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So what happened? Did it cause like major problems for the U.S.?
It definitely caused some disruptions, let me tell you, especially in industries that rely heavily on tungsten, like the defense industry, for example. They had to scramble to find alternative sources. It really exposed how vulnerable we are when it comes to certain key resources.
So it's like they were playing chess while we were playing checkers.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're thinking long-term and strategically, while we're kind of reacting in the moment. But let's go back to those tariffs for a second, because there's one argument that Trump made that this analysis calls out as being totally false. He kept saying that those tariffs would be paid for by foreign countries.
Yeah, I remember that. He made a big deal about how it wouldn't cost Americans anything.
Right. Well, that's simply not true. The idea that other countries would just absorb the cost of those tariffs is a total misconception.
So who actually ends up paying?
Us, the American consumers. The importers have to pay more for the goods, which means they raise their prices. And guess who ends up footing the bill?
We do. It's like a hidden tax.
Exactly. The analysis actually quotes this guy, Stephen Roach, who used to be a top executive at Morgan Stanley. He basically said that no credible economist believes that tariffs are paid for by foreign countries. It's just not how it works.
So it seems like there was a lot of misinformation or maybe even like deliberate deception going on around those tariffs.
Yeah.
But I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to unpack about this whole trade war thing.
Oh, yeah, we've only just begun to dig into the complexities of this issue. And it gets even more interesting when we start looking at how China has been strategically positioning itself on the world stage. But that's a story for another time. One of the key takeaways from this analysis is how differently the US and China approach this whole trade war thing.
Yeah, it's like they had completely different game plans.
Exactly. While the Trump administration was all about like quick wins and protectionist measures, trying to shield American industries.
Right, America first.
Exactly. China was playing the long game. They were thinking strategically about how to position themselves for the future, and they were willing to be patient.
So what did that actually look like? Like, what were they doing while we were busy slapping tariffs on everything?
Well, for one thing, they were busy strengthening ties with other countries, especially in Asia and Africa.
Okay.
They were investing heavily in infrastructure projects, building new trade routes, and forging these strategic partnerships. It was all about expanding their influence and securing access to key resources.
So is that what that whole Belt and Road initiative is about? I
Yeah.
remember hearing about that a few years back,
hmm
but I never really understood what it was all about.
That's exactly what it is. It's this massive infrastructure project that's basically connecting China to the rest of the world through this network of roads, railways, ports, pipelines, like a modern-day Silk Road.
Wow, that's pretty ambitious.
It is. And it's a way for China to expand its economic and political influence on a global scale.
So it's not just about economics.
Yeah,
It's about geopolitics, too.
exactly. They're playing the long game. They're thinking about how to reshape the global order, and they're using their economic power to do it.
And while we were focused on, like, winning the next election cycle.
Right. They were thinking about the next decade, the next century. It's a completely different mindset. And it's not just infrastructure. They've also been making big moves in the tech world, investing heavily in artificial intelligence, 5G networks, all that cutting edge stuff.
Right, so they're trying to become a global leader in technology, too.
Exactly. They want to be the ones setting the standards, controlling the technology that shapes the future. And if they can do that, they'll have a huge advantage in the global market.
Because everyone will have to come to them for the latest and greatest tech.
Right. Exactly. It's all part of a bigger strategy to shift the balance of global power. And while the U.S. has been preoccupied with its own internal divisions and short-term economic gains, China has been quietly and methodically laying the groundwork for a new world order.
Okay, so we've talked about tariffs, China's control of tungsten, and their long-term strategic approach. But there's another piece of this puzzle that I think is really crucial to understand. The potential decline of the U.S. dollar. That's something this analysis really emphasizes. And it's a pretty scary thought.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's directly related to Trump's trade policies. You see, the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency for decades. It's what countries use for international transactions. It's what central banks hold in reserve.
So it's like the gold standard. But instead of gold, it's the dollar.
Exactly. And just like gold was once seen as this safe and reliable store of value, the U.S. dollar has enjoyed a similar status in the global economy. But Trump's trade policies put that status at risk.
How could tariffs possibly impact something as big and powerful as the U.S. dollar?
Well, remember how we talked about tariffs restricting the flow of dollars globally? When you make it more expensive for other countries to buy stuff from the U.S., you're limiting their access to dollars. And if they don't have enough dollars, it becomes harder for them to participate in international trade. So they start looking for alternatives.
So it's like a domino effect. Tariffs create a shortage of dollars, which makes it harder for other countries to trade, and that weakens the dollar's position as the global reserve currency.
Exactly. And as the dollar weakens, other currencies have the opportunity to step in and fill the void. And guess who's been waiting in the wings, ready to capitalize on this shift?
China.
Bingo. They've been strategically promoting that own currency, the yuan, as a potential alternative to the dollar. They've been signing currency swap agreements with other countries, allowing them to trade directly in yuan instead of dollars.
So they're creating a parallel financial system that doesn't rely on the U.S. dollar.
Pretty much. And if this trend continues, it could have huge implications for the global economy. The U.S. dollar has enjoyed a privileged position for so long that it's hard to even imagine a world where it's not the dominant currency. But that world might be closer than we think.
What would they even look like?
Yeah.
Like, what would happen to the U.S. if the dollar lost its reserve currency status?
Well, it wouldn't be pretty, that's for sure. It could lead to higher interest rates here in the US, which would make it more expensive for the government to borrow money. It could also lead to inflation as the cost of imported goods goes up. And in the long run, it could really diminish America's global influence and economic power.
So are you saying like the U.S. could become less powerful on the world stage?
It's definitely a possibility. If the dollar loses its dominance, it would be a major blow to US prestige and influence.
So is this like a done deal? Is the dollar's decline inevitable?
It's not a certainty, but it's a real possibility. There are things the U.S. could do to try to mitigate these risks and maintain the dollar's dominance. But it would require a major shift in thinking. We'd have to acknowledge that the world is changing and that we can't just keep doing things the way we've always done them.
So what can we do? Like what are the steps the U.S. could take to counter China's rise and ensure that the dollar remains the top dog?
Well, for starters, we need to recognize that we can't go it alone in this globalized world. Global leadership in the 21st century requires cooperation and collaboration. We need to rebuild relationships with our allies, strengthen existing trade agreements, and work to create a more stable and predictable global trading system.
So instead of America first, it's more like America with the world.
Exactly. We need to be building bridges, not walls. But it's not just about diplomacy. We also need to address our own vulnerabilities, like our dependence on China for critical resources like tungsten. We need to diversify our supply chains, look for alternative sources, invest in domestic production.
So basically, we need to be less reliant on any one country, especially one that we have such a complicated relationship with.
Exactly. It's about spreading the risk and making sure we have access to the resources we need, even if things get tense geopolitically. But it all comes down to this. We need to be more strategic in our approach to global trade and economic policy. We can't afford to be reactive or short-sighted. We need to be thinking long-term and anticipating the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
It's like we need to up our game.
We do. If we want to maintain our position as a global leader, we need to be smarter, more strategic, and more collaborative in our approach. The world is changing, and we need to change with it. Otherwise, we risk being left behind.
Okay, so I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today. Like we really dug into this whole Trump trade war thing and how it's all playing out with China.
Yeah, definitely. We started with those tariffs, right? And how they maybe weren't the magic solution they were made out to be.
Yeah, they ended up hurting American consumers more than anyone else, it seems like.
Yeah.
And then there's that whole tungsten thing. You know, China basically controlling this super important metal that we need for all sorts of stuff.
Right. It's kind of scary to think about how much leverage that gives them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the whole U.S. dollar situation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, could it actually lose its place as the world's leading currency?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a possibility, especially if things keep going the way they are.
This analysis makes a pretty compelling case that we need to, like, wake up and smell the coffee. We can't just keep doing business as usual and expect to stay on top.
Exactly. The world is changing, and we need to adapt. We need to be more strategic, more collaborative, and more forward-thinking. Otherwise, we're going to get left behind.
So what about that investment opportunity?
Mm-hmm.
The source mentions it kind of subtly.
Yeah.
But with everything going on with tungsten, it seems like there's a real chance for U.S. companies to step up and offer an alternative to Chinese imports.
Yeah, there's definitely potential there. I mean, the demand for tungsten isn't going away anytime soon. And with all the geopolitical uncertainty, who knows what's going to happen with Chinese supply. So if U.S. companies can offer a reliable and ethically sourced alternative, I think they could really capitalize on that.
It makes you wonder why we stopped mining tungsten in the first place.
Yeah,
Maybe it's time to bring that industry back.
could be. It would definitely be a way to reduce our dependence on China. And it would create jobs here in the U.S. It's something to think about for sure.
So the big takeaway for me is that we need to be more proactive about shaping the future of the global economy. We can't just sit back and react to what other countries are doing.
I agree. We need to be playing offense, not defense. We need to be setting the agenda, not just responding to it.
And that means thinking long-term, building strong relationships with our allies, and making sure we're not putting all our eggs in one basket.
Exactly. It's about diversification, collaboration, and strategic thinking.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. This has been a really fascinating deep dive into a complex and timely issue.
It really has. And it's something that we all need to be paying attention to. The future of the global economy is at stake, and the choices we make today will have a profound impact on that future.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep engaging. Because we all have a role to play in shaping the world we want to live in.